The key informant interview findings, we've already alluded to some of this. Every single one of the participants agreed that organizations should in fact have a formal written gift acceptance policy. Every one of the respondents found that they are helpful and should be used regularly, and that they should be updated frequently, and they must clearly define acceptable gifts. They need to be very explicit. And they are, again, a very useful educational tool for donors. So it's a practical application apart from just a thumbs up or thumbs down on an individual gift. Conclusions and recommendations of the research. Number one, nonprofits need to have a formal written gift acceptance policy. Every one of the methodologies confirmed this. Policies must clearly describe acceptable gifts. They must be reviewed and updated frequently to ensure legal compliance as a bare minimum. And there is a high emphasis on planned giving as a practical application for gift acceptance policies. They need to be flexible. They need to demonstrate ethical practice and organizational values. And again, they must be consistent with your mission and vision and sort of the culture of your organization. And they must clearly define the gift acceptance process and authority. Who specifically within your organization has what specific responsibility in the chain of acceptance. And again, if it's a very small, lean organization, that could be one or two people. If it's a very large, complex organization, there'd be multiple layers. But that needs to be, especially in the case of a larger organization, needs to be part of the gift acceptance policy document itself. So again, primarily an internal application, but a very important one. Areas for further study. Again, at the time the research was conducted, it was very clear that a wider survey of other institutions would be very helpful, even if it's just within the state of Minnesota. If this survey were expanded to include public colleges and universities, other nonprofit organizations, if there could be a wider disbursement of the types of nonprofits surveyed, that would be an interesting comparison to make. And then, as is, I believe, always the case, I think it would be advantageous to repeat the process several times over a long period of time so that we can measure change, even if the universe remains the same.
Can I ask you a question about
Sure.
that? Assuming a wider survey of other institutions was done, other educational institutions, would you anticipate the results to be similar, or would you anticipate they'd be different?
It depends on what, in my opinion, what the wider range of institutions might be. If you're talking about four-year colleges and universities that are public, I would suspect that there would be a higher degree of oversight required due to the fact that they receive public funding in one way or another, state and federal. And there are often higher levels of fiduciary responsibility and legal compliance associated with those kinds of budgetary sources. So I would guess, based on a general trend of a higher degree of accountability for public money, that there would be a higher degree of internal processes in place, and perhaps they might be used at a higher level in a public institution.
I could piggyback on that question. So your results, 85% in private universities and colleges. If you look at the three top organizations, churches, higher ed, and health, and you saw such a good rate for even private education, would you assume that those numbers are so much higher because of the number in their database is so large that they have to have that in place because of the multiple visits they do, as opposed to one church in a suburban area and a health organization, you know, with a database of 10,000? Is it the size of their database that really forces them to have those policies in place?
I would not, the research would not indicate that there's a direct relationship between the number of donors or prospective donors and the degree to which a gift acceptance policy is either existing or is used. I think a more, again, based on the research, a more direct linkage is the level of complexity of the fundraising operation as a whole would tend to produce a higher degree of gift acceptance policy establishment and use. It's a tool, like any tool. If there's a need for the tool, you then either create or acquire the tool and then use it. If the type of fundraising you're doing as an organization does not intrinsically require that tool, you may or may not choose to create it. In an organization like a public higher ed or a healthcare organization, it seems like they would already have systems in place for managing their budgetary processes and their fiduciary responsibility. So having a gift acceptance policy would be one of a number of policies that they would already have in place for other reasons. Whereas, for example, the other example you used was an individual church. They might not. There might not be a policy for gift acceptance. There might also not be a policy for snow days or dress code, or whatever it happens to be. So it seems to make sense. And again, especially the key informant interviews would bear this out. And again, the full interview findings are available in the PDM itself. There seems to be a pretty strong correlation between the level of sophistication and complexity of the fundraising being conducted and the increased likelihood and subsequent use of gift acceptance policies.
It's interesting, though, because in an organization where I am, where we have a supporting organization, which is the fundraising arm of a public institution, we find that there is that increased complexity in fiducial responsibility to the public side of the organization, but the foundation that supports the institution doesn't necessarily carry that fiduciary responsibility over. And so I think it would depend in part also on the embeddedness of the relationship.
Sure.
And so it's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, and another factor that I think would be an interesting area for further study, do organizations that have a clear delineation because of legal reasons or just practice between the sort of host entity and the fundraising specific entity, is there what's the relationship and what's the correlation, if any, between those organizations or that organizational structure and gift acceptance policy, either creation or use? That could be a very interesting area of further research.
I know in our case there's a policy regarding the transfer of funds from the supporting organization to the public institution. And that policy has been in existence for many, many years, whereas a formal gift acceptance policy on behalf of the fundraising arm has only recently.
And that might have to do with the level of complexity
So.
or the
I think that's
heightened
really
activity
a
in
reason.
fundraising.
Yep.
Makes sense. Any other questions? Thank you.
Good job.